Sauron is the title character and the primary antagonist, through the forging of the One Ring, of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where he rules the land of Mordor and has the ambition of ruling the whole of Middle-earth. In the same work, he is identified as the necromancer of Tolkien's earlier novel The Hobbit. The Silmarillion describes him as the chief lieutenant of the first Dark Lord, Morgoth. Tolkien noted that the Ainur, the angelic powers of his constructed myth, were capable of many degrees of error and failing, but by far the worst was the absolute satanic rebellion and evil of Morgoth and his satellite Sauron. Sauron appears most often as the Eye, as if disembodied. Tolkien, while denying that absolute evil could exist, stated that Sauron came as near to a wholly evil will as was possible. Commentators have compared Sauron to the title character of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, and to Balor of the Evil Eye in Celtic mythology. Sauron is briefly seen in a humanoid form in Peter Jackson's film trilogy, which otherwise shows him as a disembodied, flaming eye. Name: Melkor was renamed Morgoth when he destroyed the two trees of Valinor, murdered Finwë, the High King of the Noldor Elves, and stole the Silmarils in the First Age. The darker name was then bestowed by Finwë's son Fëanor, and the elves called him thereafter by that name alone. The name Morgoth is Sindarin and means dark enemy or black foe. Boglar is also Sindarin, meaning tyrant or oppressor. According to Morgoth's ring, Fëanor named him Maringatho or Maringatho in Quenya, and this was later translated into Sindarin as Morgoth. Morgoth Boglar is thus an epithet. His name in Ainulindal is Melkor, which means he who arises in might in Quenya. This too is an epithet since he, like all the Vala, had another true name in Valoran, but this name was not recorded. The Sindarin equivalent of Melkor is Belegur, but it is never used. Instead, a deliberately similar name, Belagath, meaning great death, was employed. Another form of his name was Melko, simply meaning mighty one. Like Sauron, he had a host of other titles: Lord of the Dark Power of the North, the Black Hand, and Great Enemy. The Edain called him the Dark King and the Dark Power. The Númenóreans corrupted by Sauron called him the Lord of All and the Giver of Freedom. He was called Master of Lies by Amlach of the House of Hadar. Fictional history. Ainulindal/I. None. I Quenta Silmarillion/I. None. I Children of Hurin/I. None. I The Lord of the Rings/I. None. Development. In the early versions of Tolkien's stories, Melkor/Morgoth was not seen as the most powerful of the Vala. He is described as being equal in power to Manwë, chief of the Vala in Arda. But his power increased in later revisions of the story until he became the most powerful among them, and in a late essay more powerful than all of the other Vala combined. He developed from a standout among equals into a being so powerful that the other created beings could not utterly defeat him. Over time, Tolkien altered both the conception of this character and his name. The name given by Fëanor, Morgoth, was present from the first stories. He was for a long time also called Melko. Tolkien vacillated over the Sindarin equivalent of this, which appeared as Belcha, Meleager, and Moaleg. The meaning of the name also varied, related in different times to Mielka or Velka. Similarly, the Old English translations devised by Tolkien differ in sense. Melko is rendered as Orgel and Morgoth as Swert Os. Morgoth is once given a particular sphere of interest. In the early tale of Turambar, Tynwalint names him the Vala of Iron. Melkor's inability to create anything genuinely new is tied to the idea that something of one's actual being must pass into the things one creates, so as to give them an effective substance and reality. Melkor could not truly create, as he did not possess the flame imperishable, thus he could only create a mockery of those things in Arda. From his trolls to the sun, Melkor's power and essence was poured into Arda. Melkor's individual self was diminished as a consequence. He was reduced to Morgoth, the dark enemy. Morgoth, once the most powerful being in Ea, spent his will on his vast armies and followers, so that in the War of Wrath, as his armies were swept away before the host of Aman, he was captured by Eanwi and cast off his throne. Morgoth's spirit was cast out beyond the walls of night, yet his presence remains as the pervasive corruption of the world, even until the end of days. After Morgoth's defeat, his lieutenant Sauron gradually rallied many of Morgoth's servants to his own cause, and during the Second Age established himself in the land of Mordor. Sauron lacked the raw power and malice of his master, but he seduced many to his allegiance with lies and false promises. In the Second Age, Sauron repeatedly used his fame among men as Morgoth's erstwhile lieutenant to portray himself as Morgoth's representative and thus gain the allegiance of his former master's worshippers. Similarly, in Numenor following his capture, Sauron became very powerful by seducing Ar-Pharazôn to the worship of Melkor, establishing a cult in which it was only natural that, as Melkor's foremost former disciple, he became high priest. This cult exploited the Numenorean fear of death by claiming that human sacrifice to Melkor would grant the men of Numenor immortality. In actuality, by turning away from Eru and the Vala they only dwindled more rapidly. Sauron used this religion among his means of encouraging Ar-Pharazôn's invasion of Valinor, which resulted in the destruction of Numenor by Eru. By the Third Age, Sauron came more often to propound himself, rather than Morgoth, as the object of worship for his servants and subjects, but in his pride, also portrayed himself as Morgoth returned when it was more convenient for him to do so. Interpretation. Melkor has been interpreted as analogous to Satan, once the greatest of all God's angels, Lucifer, but fallen through pride, he rebels against his creator. John R. Holmes, writing in the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia, suggests that Melkor's nature resonates with John Milton's fallen angel in Paradise Lost. Just as in Christian tradition Satan leads humanity to become slaves of sin, Melkor creates an iron hell for his elven slave laborers. His greed for ever more power and his fondness for technology make him a symbol for the despotism of modern machinery. His rebellion against Eru is creative, as Melkor is impatient for the void of the world to be filled with things. But his creativity becomes destructive, as it is tainted with pride. His desire to create other beings for his glory turns into a desire for servants and slaves to follow his own will. This temptation of creativity is echoed in Tolkien's work by Melkor's opponent Fëanor, who loves the Silmarils he created so much that he leads his entire people to a hopeless war when Melkor steals them. The Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey writes that the Silmarillion is most obviously a calque on the Book of Genesis. Tolkien thus says that even Melkor begins with good intentions, just as Satan was created good. Shippey concludes that clearly the reader can assume that the exploit of Morgoth of which the Eldar never learnt was the traditional seduction of Adam and Eve by the serpent, while the men in the story are Adam's descendants flying from Eden and subject to the curse of Babel. The Tolkien scholar Marjorie Burns writes in Tolkien's Legendarium, Essays on the History of Middle-earth that Morgoth, like all Tolkien's Middle-earth characters, is based on a complex literary soup. One element of his construction, she states, is the Norse god Odin. Tolkien used aspects of Odin's character and appearance for the wandering wizard Gandalf, with hat, beard, and staff, and a supernaturally fast horse, recalling Odin's steed Sleipnir, for the Dark Lord Sauron, with his single eye, for the corrupted white wizard Saruman, cloaked and hatted like Gandalf, but with far-flying birds like Odin's eagles and ravens. In the Silmarillion, too, the far-seeing Vala Manwë, who lives on the tallest of the mountains, and loves all swift birds, strong of wing, is Odin-esque. And just as Sauron and Saruman oppose Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, so the enemy Morgoth gets Odin's negative characteristics: his ruthlessness, his destructiveness, his malevolence, his all-pervading deceit. Burns compares this allocation to the way that Norse myth allots some of Odin's characteristics to the troublemaker god Loki. Odin has many names, among them shifty-eyed and swift in deceit, and he is equally a god of the Norse underworld, father of the slain. She notes that Morgoth, too, is named Master of Lies and Demon of Dark, and who functions as a fierce god of battle. The Tolkien scholar Verlin Flieger, discussing the splintering of the original created light of Middle-earth, notes both that Melkor initiates the rebellion against Eru, and likens Melkor/Morgoth's response to the Silmarils to that of Fëanor, who had created those jewels. She states that desire to possess is the cardinal temptation, and possessiveness the great transgression in Tolkien's cosmology, observing that the commandment "Love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart" is actually stated in the Silmarillion. Flieger compares Tolkien's descriptions of the two characters. The heart of Fëanor was fast bound to these things that he himself had made, followed at once by Melkor lusted for the Silmarils, and the very memory of their radiance was a gnawing fire in his heart. She writes that it is a fitting irony that Melkor and Fëanor, each one the best and brightest of his kind, Melkor being the greatest of the Ainur, Fëanor the most subtle and skillful of the creative Noldor among the elves, should usher in the darkness. See also Madros. The Tale of Búrin and Lúthien.